Okay, so this is video number 2 or part 2 to AP Bio's topic 8.1 responses to the environment. So it's going to be a little different, I think, how this flows. First, we're going to look at some examples of how organisms can exchange information with one another in response to internal changes and external cues, which can then change behavior. So let's go ahead and look at the fight or flight response first. So in the fight or flight response, this is where an organism has an external stimulus, like a predator of some kind, coming at them, right? And so that's going to cause a change inside of them to activate certain hormones. So they're going to have an increase in adrenaline and cortisol, and that's going to change their physiology to help them either fight or flight. Now they can communicate this if they're like in a herd, and then that'll cause a change in behavior for, like in this example, these antelope to start to run, or if it's like a group of wildebeest, they all start, I'm not charging, what is the word? Like running from the, maybe lions or something. And so that would be a fight or flight response to external cues. We also have an example of predator warnings, where this cool study done and published in Nature is where you have these little birds at the bottom, C and D. They are called nuthatches, that when the scientists played an audio recording of a great horned owl, A, or a pygmy owl, B, the pygmy owl is the main predator of nuthatches. So the way the nuthatches responded and communicated with their population in the forest was different. They had a more intense response or predator warning when they heard the sounds of the pygmy owl, which was their main predator. So that is a way that they can communicate. So basically, an external cue or stimulus causes them to respond and communicate with their peers. I don't know if it's called peers or not in birds. And so squirrels do the same thing. Now here's an example of how plants can respond to herbivory. So when a caterpillar bites the leaves of a plant, a lima bean, the lima bean sends out a hormone or a chemical to their other lima beans growing nearby, and together they turn on gene expression to release a sweet nectar. The nectar attracts wasps. The wasps lay their eggs in the caterpillar, and then the larvae feed off the caterpillar, and it kills the caterpillar, and now the lima bean is protected. So that is a rad example of how lima beans can communicate with each other to bring about a response, right? So now we're going to move into communication between organisms. So we have a couple different factors to look at. One is how signaling behaviors or communicating can produce changes in the behavior of another species and or result in differential reproductive success. So there's territory markings when animals rub their certain glands or chemicals onto trees, or if you have a dog who pees every time you take them for a walk, they're marking their territory. So that marking is going to then communicate with other members of different species or the same species about who's in that region. Pack behavior can produce changes in the behaviors of others. There's territory warnings. So we'll see an example of some male stickleback fish. Flowers have certain coloration that will actually communicate with their pollinators. And then there's birds who use songs. We saw earlier, not just predator warnings, but also for reproduction, right? To attract mates, which then can lead to differential reproductive success. So let's go ahead though and talk about some examples of visual and in this case, chemical signals. So here with wolves, it's a perfect example of how they use certain visual ways to communicate and indicate dominance. So we see if you have a pet dog, for example, you've probably seen some of these body postures in your dog. That's a way that they are communicating with you through a visual communication style. Now, dogs can also do audible or auditory communication through barking or growling or yelping or whining. So there's auditory as well as visual communication in dogs. Bees are going to use an example of visual communication. So bees do this cute little waggle dance that communicates with the rest of their hive the location and distance of their food. How long the waggle is a signal of how far the bees need to fly when they leave the nest. Now, their angle of how they do the dance also tells the rest of the hive when they leave the nest where to fly. Now, interestingly enough, if there's a headwind, so if the bees have to fly in this direction and there's wind coming at them, they will actually waggle longer, telling their hive mates, I don't know, that they have to fly even farther because to take into account the wind. So the way bees communicate is super intricate and rad. And so there's more videos on the internet that you can look into about the waggle dance for bees and how they communicate. Okay, I'm trying to hit next. Now, pheromones are an example of chemical communication. So when we talk about reproductive success, there are actually some species where a female will not ovulate unless there's a male pheromone present. And that male pheromone will act as like a ligand to turn on gene expression and cause changes in the female to go through ovulation. And so these pheromones are a way that organisms can communicate with each other. And I also want to point out that they are odorless. It's not a scent, but rather like a subconscious message, I guess. We also see pheromones in bee colonies or bee hives. I don't know. So like here you have a queen bee, and she actually will send out a pheromone that attracts her daughters, her female workers, to her. Now, interestingly, this pheromone also acts as an inhibitor on the ovary development of her daughters, which leaves her as the only reproducing female in the hive. The pheromone also attracts males, so when she flies out of the nest, males will fly to her for reproduction, all from this pheromone chemical being sent out. Now, we also, ants will use pheromones for their communication of where to find food. That's a TED Ed video you can watch. Now, we also have alarm pheromones. So there's this little mouse here. Let's say it's hiding in the forest and a fox or predator comes and now the mouse is all tense. It will actually send out alarm pheromones that cause the other mice in the area to respond and put them on high alert. Think about it. Now they're on high alert and waiting and primed and ready to respond to a predator. This is also why, like in humans, if you're around someone else who's like stressed out, you get kind of stressed out because there's like pheromones coming off of them that your body is like, yo, if you're stressed, there must be something in our environment that's like dangerous. Let me be on high alert as well. Okay, so animals, we do release these pheromones into the air and it helps us survive as a species. Okay, so let's go ahead and see that the red male stickleback fish who establishes his territory. So some scientists discovered this. They had some male stickleback fish in their lab. And what they know about stickleback fish is that when another male comes into the territory, the first male will actually become aggressive, right? To like establish, this is my territory. Well, what they found though, just by chance, is there was a window near the table where the tank was. And when like a red vehicle would drive by the window, the fish would get aggressive towards the red car or truck driving by. So the scientists were like, yo, is it the presence of another male or is it something red that's causing this response? So they put in fish without a red bottom and there was no aggressiveness. Now this could be because the female stickleback fish do not have a red bottom. So the males want to welcome the females into the territory. That's the whole point for reproduction. And so they followed up this experiment with using little like not toys, but like fake things that had a red bottom. And sure as anything, when they put the red bottom objects into the territory of the male stickleback fish, it became aggressive. And so what they concluded was that this territory response is an unlearned act. And so this is called a fixed action pattern, that this is an innate behavior. This is not learned. It's something hardwired in the neurons of the stickleback fish. And so the stimulus was the red bottom and the response was a behavior that was not learned, but rather innate. Now, when we talk about communication in different species, though, this ability to communicate is, or can be, I should say, acted on by natural selection. So when we look at part A here, it says natural selection favors innate and learned behaviors that increase survival and reproductive fitness. So some bird songs are innate, and that's going to increase reproduction in those species. And then we'll talk in a minute about some learned behaviors. So, and then cooperative behaviors we'll talk about as well. But this is kind of a really sad story that example of the importance of communication between species and then determining fitness, high or low fitness. So in 2004, the New York Times wrote an article about the loneliest whale in the world. Scientists have been tracking her since 1992, and they discovered the problem. She isn't like any other baleen whale. Unlike all other whales, she doesn't have friends. She doesn't have a family. She doesn't belong to any tribe, pack, or gang. She doesn't have a lover, and she never had one. Her songs come in groups of 2 to 6 calls, lasting for 5 to 6 seconds each. But her voice is unlike any other baleen whale. It is unique. While the rest of her kind communicate between 12 and 25 hertz, she sings at 52 hertz. You see, that's precisely the problem. No other whales can hear her. Every one of her desperate calls to communicate remains unanswered, each cry ignored. And with every lonely song, she becomes sadder and more frustrated, her notes going deeper in despair as the years go by. So here, she's unable to communicate due to variation in how she developed, and now she has low fitness. She's not able to reproduce. So she may live a long time, but remember, fitness is based on reproductive success. And so here, this would be an example of low fitness because of the inability to communicate. Okay, so let's just compare and contrast these behaviors that can be acted on by natural selection. So innate behaviors are genetically hardwired, like the male stickleback fish responding to the red underside of an object. So there's no prior experience. It's like they're born knowing how to do it. So examples of this would be suckling in mammals. If you can't breastfeed as a mammal, you don't have that hardwired like ability to just do it instinctually. You're gonna die. Like that's low fitness if you can't feed, right? Swimming in whales is an innate behavior, or building a nest in birds. Like these are all essential to survival, and they didn't have to be taught. Or instincts like pulling your hand away from a fire. Like we shouldn't have to learn how to do that. That's an instinct that was selected for by natural selection, right? Whereas learned behaviors are things that organisms can learn in their life. So for example, habituation. For example, like prairie dogs, maybe initially they might see a hiker and then become defensive, but over time they become, it's not a habit, but they become used to the hikers, and they've learned that the hikers are not a threat. So that is an example of a learned behavior. They no longer respond defensively. They are just used to the hikers walking by. So that's a learned behavior. Or associative learning. So here, like a blue jay eating a monarch. Monarchs are very like foul tasting and kind of poisonous. So then the bird will like throw up. So to see the black and orange monarch butterfly after eating it one time, it's going to learn, oh yeah, the last time I ate that, I threw up. So that's a learned behavior. And then also, or like seeing a skunk. Oh, I got sprayed by a skunk the last time I saw a black and white organism. I'm going to learn to avoid that marking or coloration. So those are learned behaviors that can be acted on by natural selection. Then you have insight learning, the ability to problem solve, right? So they did some studies on primates and things. So to be able to use tools out in nature and the ability to learn or watch. Like dolphins have been observed teaching their young how to use like a sponge for protection on their nose. So when a dolphin like goes into the coral reef, coral is sharp, so their nose might get cut. So they've actually learned to pick up a sponge and put it over their nose as like a cushion and not scratch themselves. And they've been observed teaching their young how to do that. So those would be examples of learned behaviors. Now, when we tie this into natural selection, though, parent and offspring interactions and teaching the offspring how to survive is important for success. So like a mama bear may spend up to 2 years with her cub teaching them how to find food, how to like not necessarily teach them courtship rituals, but like teaching them how to survive. And if an offspring is not able to learn, that's low fitness. And so the ability to learn is selected for by natural selection. And then our last topic here in our response to the environment is called kin selection. And in kin selection, it's a type of natural selection that considers the role relatives play when evaluating genetic fitness of a given individual. So an example of this are in prairie dogs or ground squirrels. And so when they see a predator, they send out a warning call, well, then the rest of their family then responds and can hide. So it's a way of like communicating, but it puts if I'm the one like giving the warning call of a predator, I am now attracting the predator to me. That lowers my individual fitness. But if you look at who is in my like group, they're probably related to me. So my genes and genetics are going to be shared. So when they look at like a ground squirrel population though, a lot of times the males will move out and then the females stay behind. So there's a lot of like aunts and sisters and mothers and granddaughters. And so there's a lot of like related individuals. And so that warning call may not benefit you directly, but it's going to benefit your family. And so that is sometimes called like, oh gosh, inclusive fitness, I think is another way to say it. So that is kin selection, and it benefits relatives, increases the fitness of relatives while lowering an individual's fitness. All right, that is the end of 8.1. Lots of random things. Great job.